The morning started slow, like most of them did in 1950s Ontario, with the smell of wood smoke curling from chimneys, a layer of frost on the window pane, and a kettle whistling over a cast iron stove. The sound of the CBC radio crackled through the kitchen, bringing with it the clipped cadence of English Canada and the lyrical lilt of Quebecois French. That was how mornings began, with news, weather, and the voice of someone you never met but knew by heart. Out front, the snowbanks were still tall from last week's storm. The neighbor's kid, bundled in a red parka and plaid scarf, dragged a wooden toboggan down the street. No one was in a hurry. School wouldn't start until the plow came through, and even then, maybe not. Mom stood at the stove in slippers stirring porridge with a wooden spoon worn smooth at the edges. She added brown sugar and a splash of maple syrup, the real kind, not the store-bought stuff. Dad, already in his work boots, sat by the window lacing them up. No talk of work-life balance, just work, and then home. The house smelled like toast, wet mittens, and the faint bite of winter air slipping through the gaps in the window frames. You didn't fix drafts with insulation. You fixed them with sweaters. The milkman had been by already, and the glass bottles sat waiting by the door. Little paper caps still beaded with cold. He always waved if you caught him friendly, but never late. And the breadman Thursdays. You remembered because Thursday meant raisin bread if you were lucky. You didn't lock the door. Not because crime didn't exist, but because trust did. The back door was for neighbors, and the front door was for guests. And if someone knocked, it was either a friend, a cousin, or the pastor dropping off the bulletin he forgot to leave in your mailbox. The living room wasn't large, but it held everything that mattered: a brown corduroy couch that creaked when you sat down, a patchwork quilt thrown over the armrest, and a black and white television the size of a sewing machine but heavier than the family dog. It only had 3 channels, and sometimes none. When the signal was weak, you didn't complain. You held the rabbit ears, adjusted the foil, and prayed the hockey night in Canada broadcast would hold steady long enough to catch the second period. Behind the couch was where the family photo wall began. It wasn't curated or symmetrical. It was layered like memory itself. A wedding portrait in sepia. A baby in a wash basin. A soldier in uniform, not smiling, but proud. Everyone had someone in uniform back then, a brother, a cousin, or someone who never came back, but was still talked about as if he might walk through the door one snowy evening. The floor was linoleum in the kitchen, and real wood everywhere else. It creaked with every step, a soft warning system for kids sneaking cookies or trying to skip piano practice. The kitchen radio sat above the bread box, and it sang out the world in mono. The royal family's visit to Ottawa, the new Maple Leafs roster, weather from Winnipeg to Moncton. All of Canada shrunk into one warm kitchen speaker. We drank milk from glass bottles and called margarine butter only when the real thing ran out. Toast was scraped with a knife not pressed down in slots. Peanut butter came in a tin can. Jam was homemade or nothing. And in the pantry, canned salmon from the Pacific coast sat beside jars of chokecherry jelly and boxes of red rose tea. There were no dishwashers. That was a child's job. You didn't rinse first because hot water was a luxury, and everyone knew that dish soap worked better if you had elbow grease. We washed. rinsed and dried in rhythm. Older kids washed younger ones dried, and whoever broke a plate had to sweep quietly and hope mom didn't notice. On Sundays, the table was set with linen napkins and mismatched china passed down from someone's grandmother. Roast beef, mashed potatoes, creamed corn if you were lucky, and Jell-O with suspended fruit if you weren't. The plates weren't Instagram ready, but they were full. The meal wasn't about presentation. It was about being together. And you always saved a plate for Uncle George, even if he arrived 2 hours late with snow in his eyebrows and a story you'd already heard 3 times before. Kids played outside until their cheeks were red and their boots full of snow. We didn't ask for screen time. Our screens were frost-covered windows, etched with the patterns of January. We built snow forts so deep you could sit inside and eat your sandwich without feeling the wind. The best tobogganing hill was behind the Catholic church, and every kid knew the route that gave the longest slide and the best bruises. We didn't have snow pants. We had wool trousers and long underwear that itched like fire. Zippers froze, scarves unraveled. But we didn't care, because you only came inside when your mittens were too stiff to move, or your little sister started crying from cold. At school, the bell rang from a real bell tower. You stood in line, hats off boots, dripping in the cloakroom. Classrooms smelled like chalk dust pencil shavings and someone's lunch wrapped in wax paper. You sat up straight. You raised your hand. And if you spoke out of turn, you got the look from Miss Ferguson that could freeze maple sap. We wrote in cursive with fountain pens and inkwells still set into the desks even though nobody used them. You didn't Google facts. You opened the World Book Encyclopedia and hoped the volume with the letter M wasn't already taken home by someone else. Recess meant slush fights and huddles behind snowbanks. There were no plastic slides, just icy hills and tin lunchboxes dented from the fall. And if you forgot your mittens, you learned fast not to forget again. At home, Mom mended socks in the evenings and listened to Tommy Hunter on the radio. The thread was cotton. The stitch was patience. The rhythm was love. She didn't say much, but you could hear it in the way she folded the towels or set your scarf out near the heater before bed. Bedtime meant stories, not from books, but from Dad, who told them better anyway. His voice was steady, and the stories never changed the fishing trip where the canoe tipped the raccoon that got into the chicken feed the time he met Gordie Howe and didn't even realize it. We laughed in the same places every time. That was the point. Summer arrived, not with fanfare, but with a quiet stretching of days, sun lingering past bedtime, and the hum of mosquitoes louder than any news from the radio. In 1950s Canada, June smelled like cut grass citronella and something sweet wafting from the neighbor's barbecue. The school bell rang for the last time in late June, and then it was barefoot freedom until Labor Day. Kids roamed the neighborhood like squirrels, darting through backyards, climbing fences, and returning only when the porch light flicked on, or someone shouted their name across 3 blocks. We rode our bikes down gravel roads so dusty they left clouds behind us, like smoke trails. Helmets didn't exist, just sunburnt shoulders and knees scabbed over from yesterday's adventure. There were no summer camps with glossy brochures. Camp was Grandma's farm, or the patch of woods behind the co-op store, or a pup tent made from bed sheets and clothespins in the backyard. and somehow those places felt infinite. A single stick became a sword or a fishing pole or the rudder of a ship bound for Hudson's Bay. The ice cream man came around in the afternoon, his truck playing the Maple Leaf Rag through tinny speakers. Kids would scatter screaming for nickels, racing inside breathless Mom, please. He's already at the Dupuy's house. The lucky ones got rocket pops or maple walnut cones wrapped in waxed paper. The rest settled for a cold orange pop from the corner store fridge, glass bottles sweating in your hand, and a straw that always bent before it worked. Fairs came to town in late July, taking over dusty fields with the scent of fried dough diesel and cotton candy. The Ferris wheel creaked, and the lights blinked in colors not quite real. You tossed rings onto bottles, won plastic trinkets, and watched your older cousins sneak kisses near the dunk tank. Everyone left with sticky hands, sunburns, and a story they'd repeat every year. At the general store, the air smelled of wood floor polish, licorice, and pipe tobacco. Penny candy really did cost a penny. Red shoelaces, marshmallow, bananas, wax bottles with syrup inside. You pointed at the jars behind the counter, not touching anything, and the shopkeeper counted out 5, sometimes 6, if you smiled politely. Afternoons were for skipping stones, and the lake wasn't just a lake. It was a mirror for the clouds and a secret world beneath the lily pads. Canoes scraped gently against old docks, and the sound of paddles dipping in and out of water was the closest thing to silence we ever heard. You didn't need a motor to go far. Just a sandwich, a thermos, and someone who knew how to read the sky. Campfires didn't come from starter logs or propane. They came from sticks paper and someone with patience. We sat around in sweaters and bug spray, listening to Uncle's tune guitars slightly out of key and tell stories that changed with every retelling. Fireflies blinked in the brush. The stars above seemed close enough to name. And when someone sang farewell to Nova Scotia, nobody spoke. We all just listened. On Sundays, the town slowed to a hush. Church pews filled. Fans waved back and forth, and afterward, picnic baskets were unpacked under elm trees beside the riverbank. Egg salad sandwiches, butter tarts, and bottles of Canada Dry. Nobody talked politics. Everyone talked about the weather. We swam in quarry pools and lakes cold enough to steal your breath. No lifeguards, no heated showers. Just rocks for diving and towels spread on sun-warmed stones. You swam until your fingers pruned and your brother stole your trunks as a prank. And you forgave him because that's what summer was for. The grown-ups sat on porches in metal chairs with plastic lacing striped red and white, green and yellow sipping rye and ginger or Labatt's 50 from stubby bottles. Radios played Hank Snow or French folk ballads, or quiet announcers reciting baseball scores from Montreal. Conversations drifted slowly like the clouds above the prairie. We picked raspberries until our fingers stained red and our arms scratched raw. Then we sold them door to door in old margarine tubs, hoping for a quarter or at least a bless your heart. There was always something to do, painting fences, chasing dogs, collecting firewood. And if you said you were bored, someone handed you a rake. Canada in summer didn't need passports or air conditioning. It needed a back porch, a breeze, and someone to laugh with. The sun didn't set so much as it leaned gently into the trees, casting long shadows that told you the day was enough. And tomorrow would come just as quietly. September didn't just mark a page on the calendar, it changed the way the air smelled. You could feel it before the leaves turned. A hush settled over the town like a quilt being drawn up slowly. Cicadas went quiet. The sun slipped away a little earlier each night, and somewhere in the house, your mother was already knitting something red. Going back to school meant new notebooks with crisp pages pencils, with untouched erasers and shoes just stiff enough to hurt. You wore your Sunday coat for the first few weeks and hoped it didn't get muddy. The bell rang at 8:45 sharp, and that sound meant summer was truly gone. Desks were lined in rows, and the chalkboard smelled like fresh dust. The teacher wore wool skirts and always had tissues tucked in her sleeve. You stood when she entered. You answered, "Yes, ma'am," and hoped she didn't call on you for mental math before recess. Outside, the maples turned orange, then crimson, then a deep kind of gold that made even the alleyway behind the grain elevator look like a postcard. Leaves crunched beneath boots that had been too tight last year. Boys played marbles under the stairs, and girls braided each other's hair while sitting on the school steps. Every laugh echoed sharper in the crisp air. You came home to the smell of something baking butter tarts, apple crisp, or molasses cookies that stuck to your teeth in the best possible way. Mom kept the house warm by turning on the oven and leaving it cracked open after supper. Nobody talked about energy bills. You just did what you needed to stay warm. Thanksgiving didn't need Pinterest recipes or family debates. It meant turkey or roast chicken if you couldn't get one mashed potatoes cranberry sauce from a glass dish and pumpkin pie made from the tin Mom kept under the sink. Everyone brought something. No one left hungry. After dinner, the men sat around with loosened belts, sipping rye, and swapping the same 3 stories they told every year. The women washed dishes with rolled-up sleeves and laughter that carried past the kitchen window. And the kids snuck out to the porch, watching their breath fog in the cold, and wondering how soon it might snow. Saturdays were for chores, raking leaves, splitting wood, and hauling in the storm windows. You wore hand-me-down flannel and gloves that didn't match, and no one cared as long as you kept moving. The radio played fiddle music or the weekend farm report. Dad fixed the fence or checked the chimney, and you helped even if you didn't know how. At night, you curled up under wool blankets, their scratchiness softened by years of use. The wind outside rattled the old window panes, and the moon lit up the yard in silver streaks. Sometimes you stayed up late enough to hear a freight train pass in the distance, and even in sleep you followed its rhythm. School lunches changed with the seasoned soup in a thermos, a slice of cheddar, a buttered bun wrapped in wax paper. You traded only if someone had chocolate pudding, and even then it was a gamble. The lunchroom buzzed with the sound of clinking metal chewing, and the occasional teacher shushing a table too loud. The hockey season started as soon as the first frost held. Kids flooded the backyard rink with garden hoses and stomped down the snow to make boards. If you had skates, you shared them. If you had gloves, you used them until the fingers were worn through. And if you scored a goal, you shouted loud enough to startle the crows. Autumn wasn't flashy. It didn't ask to be noticed. It just came steady, faithful, beautiful, in its own quiet way. Like your grandfather's stories, or the feeling of a wool scarf wrapped gently around your neck. You didn't rush it. You didn't wish it away. You just walked a little slower and let it stay. In 1950s, Canada, winter didn't just arrive, it announced itself. The first snow came like a whisper, soft and hesitant, covering the porch in powdered sugar, and the garden in silence. By December, the world had become white and still, and every breath outside left a small ghost behind. The windows frosted over from the inside, delicate ferns and feathers etched in ice by a cold that didn't ask permission. We drew on the glass with our fingers and watched our artwork melt before lunch. You didn't crank the heat, you put on a sweater, then another. And if your feet were still cold, Grandma pulled out the socks she'd knitted last winter. Boots were rubber and fleece-lined, always drying by the wood stove, steaming and slouching. Mittens hung on a line in the mudroom, stiff-soaked and steaming slightly. The snow pants crackled with every step, and if you fell in the snowbank, it stayed with you the rest of the day, clinging to your back like a secret. We built snow forts big enough to fit 2 kids and a thermos of hot cocoa. There was no YouTube tutorial, you just dug, packed, and shaped until the walls stood strong. We made tunnels, under snowdrifts, carved windows, and declared kingdoms with icicles as swords. And when the sun set at 4:15, we lit candles inside and pretended we were explorers. The rink behind the church opened after the first hard freeze. Boards were nailed together by the local dads, and the surface was cleaned by kids with shovels and mops. We didn't have a Zamboni. We had legs. The puck was made of black rubber, or if someone forgot it, a frozen bun. No one wore pads, just layers, sweaters under coats, socks over mittens, and enough bruises to prove you played. Christmas didn't sparkle. It glowed. The lights were colored bulbs on green wires, half of which never worked. They were strung across windows, looped around trees, and wound down banisters with more hope than planning. The tree stood in the living room, its base wrapped in an old wool blanket, its branches covered in tinsel that caught the morning sun like tiny icicles. Ornaments weren't themed. They were memories, a pine cone with glitter, a paper star with a child's name scribbled in crayon, a bulb older than you were that blinked on and off like a heartbeat. We didn't buy matching sets. We unwrapped the same old box each year, and every piece told a story. Gifts weren't piles. They were careful. 1 or 2 for each person, sometimes wrapped in newspaper, sometimes in last year's paper, ironed flat. A new pair of gloves, a second-hand book, a sled rebuilt by Dad in the garage after work. And somehow, each one felt like treasure. Christmas dinner was a table too full and a house too warm. Turkey or ham stuffing with raisins or without, depending on which aunt you asked. Mashed potatoes, peas, pickles from the cellar, and butter tarts with crusts that flaked like old snow. The plates were chipped but clean. The laughter was loud. The chairs mismatched, and it all felt right. After dinner, we gathered in the living room with bellies full and slippers on. The fire crackled, the record player hummed Bing Crosby, and someone always read aloud The Night Before Christmas, even if we were old enough to know better. Boxing Day meant leftovers and stillness. No big sales, no lineups at the mall. Just a walk through the snowy backyard, a board game with cousins, and the quiet joy of doing nothing with people you loved. The cold outside was honest. It didn't lie. It told you when to stay in, when to shovel, when to huddle closer. And we listened. You could hear it in the way your breath caught in the air, in the way boots squeaked on packed snow, in the way silence felt heavier after a storm. January was long and dark, but never empty. Candlelight spilled across wooden floors. Soup simmered all afternoon. Quilts were stacked high on beds, and books were read slowly, one chapter at a time. When the wind howled at the windows, you didn't fight it, you let it sing you to sleep. In 1950s, Canada, spring didn't arrive with trumpets. It tiptoed in quietly in the sound of dripping eavesdrops and the soft crunch of snow thinning beneath your boots. The first sign wasn't a flower, it was a patch of grass brown and stubborn, revealed near the south-facing wall of the house. You'd see it and run inside yelling "Spring's here," even though there was still frost on the clothesline. The snow melted from the edges inward slowly, like someone turning down the volume on winter. Puddles grew in driveways. Rubber boots returned to the porch, their cuffs stuffed with yesterday's newspaper. We splashed on purpose because being soaked and muddy meant you were outside, and that was everything. School recess moved from gymnasium floors back to gravel lots. Jump ropes appeared dusty and frayed. Girls sang rhymes in perfect rhythm while boys shot marbles in the thawing dirt. Teachers stood on the steps, arms crossed, trying not to smile. Nobody remembered who was mad at whom before the snow melted. Spring forgave that. The maple trees started to drip slow, then faster. And that was when Dad and Uncle Doug dragged out the metal spiles and battered tin buckets from the shed. The bush smelled like wood smoke and sap, and the sound of liquid hitting metal was better than music. We hauled buckets by hand, spilled half of them, and didn't care. The syrup boiled over a big barrel stove, and the steam rose like a ghost of winter leaving for good. On those early spring days, windows cracked open for the first time in months. The house filled with smells that had been waiting: damp earth, fresh air, baking bread, wet wool. The curtains danced slightly in the breeze, and it felt like even the walls were exhaling. We still wore coats, but they were unbuttoned. Still wore hats, but only because Mom made us. We saw our neighbors again, not bundled like Eskimos, but real faces, real smiles, real hellos. The man next door pulled his old bicycle from the shed. The lady across the street hung clothes again, and they actually dried in the sun. That was spring's promise, not warmth, but possibility. The postman smiled more. The milkman lingered longer on the step. Even the dog, asleep all winter by the stove, began to roam again, sniffing the air like he remembered something important. Spring cleaning wasn't a trend, it was survival. The windows were washed rugs, beaten over the clothesline, and the attic open to let the mice know their lease was up. Kids were sent outside with brooms and orders: sweep the porch, find the shovel check if the lawnmower still started. And if you did well, someone handed you a butter tart. Easter came quietly often, with snow still clinging to the fence posts. The eggs were painted by hand, sometimes uneven, always perfect. Church was fuller. Coats were lighter. And afterward, we had ham and scalloped potatoes, and a pie that tasted like it came from heaven because it had been frozen in November and saved just for this. Mom started her garden in egg cartons on the windowsill. Tomatoes, beans, marigolds for the front walk. We watched them sprout like magic green shoots reaching toward glass, fogged by our breath. The earth outside was still stubborn, but she believed. That was enough. The first thunderstorm was something sacred. We'd sit by the window lights off, listening to the sky, grumble like an old man waking up. Rain hit the roof with the sound of forgotten songs. And when it passed, the world smelled brand new. Baseball bats came out of closets. Lawn chairs returned to porches. Kids chalked hopscotch grids onto sidewalks still drying in the sun. And someone always said, "This is the year I finally fix up the shed," even if they never did. Spring in Canada was never easy. It was messy, unpredictable, sometimes gray, but in the 1950s, it meant something deeper. A second chance, another beginning. You didn't race into it. You opened your door, slowly stood on the step, took a deep breath, and whispered, "Welcome back." The seasons didn't end in the 1950s. They folded gently into one another, like pages in a well-loved book. Spring became summer without fireworks. Autumn returned without surprise. And winter never asked your permission. It just came in, sat by the fire, and stayed a while. Life moved slower, not because it had to, but because we allowed it to. You walked to the store instead of driving. You waited for the mail instead of refreshing a screen. You cooked from scratch, not to be fancy, but because that's how your mother taught you and how her mother taught her. The small things mattered more, not because we didn't dream big, but because the little things lasted. A hand-carved crib that rocked 3 generations. A quilt that held the smell of every home it slept in. A recipe card stained with butter edges curled like a smile. You knew your neighbors, and they knew you, not just your name, but your stories. Who your father was, where your mother grew up, what kind of pie your family always brought to church suppers. You didn't need a password to borrow a cup of sugar, just a knock and a smile. Radios were the heartbeat of the home voices drifting through static, carrying news, music, baseball games, and bedtime stories. The CBC was always there, polite, measured, familiar. You didn't always agree with what you heard, but you trusted the voice. Trust, that's what we had, not because we were naive, but because we believed people, more often than not, meant well. We left our doors unlocked. We left our bikes in front yards. We let our children play until dark, and we never felt like the world was waiting to hurt them. The 1950s in Canada weren't perfect, no time is. There were struggles, silence, things we now know better about. But there was a gentleness, too, a grace in how people endured, how they showed up, how they held each other without needing to say much. Some things faded like the sound of a rotary phone or the creak of a wooden porch step. Some things vanished, the milkman's whistle, the slam of a screen door, the scratch of a vinyl record on a Sunday morning. But some things stayed. The way you look at falling snow and feel quiet inside. The way you smell baking bread and think of home. The way a soft voice on the radio makes you pause even now. Maybe that's what memory is, not a museum, but a mirror. It doesn't ask you to go back. It just invites you to remember how it felt to be known, to be still, to be part of something slower, smaller, and somehow bigger than yourself. So if you ever find yourself holding an old butter tart recipe, or hear Gordon Lightfoot on a crackly radio, or sit by the fire with your grandchildren and tell them stories that start with "when I was your age," just know you're not lost. You're not behind. You're simply remembering what mattered. And that maybe is the most Canadian thing of all.